They told her to stay out of first class. Said a poor little black girl had no reason to be up there. Naomi Carter didn't answer. She just kept walking. Eyes wide, hands trembling, heart pounding. Everyone thought she was just some charity case flying alone. But no one knew she was carrying a letter that could rewrite her entire identity. And the man who glared at her when she passed by, the billionaire in the perfect suit, he had a secret in his pocket. A secret with her father's face on it. 30 minutes later, he would collapse midair. And Naomi, the girl they told didn't belong, would be the only person who could save his life. What he whispered when he woke up made her cry so hard. The whole plane fell silent. "Don't you die on me." Naomi's small hands trembled as she pressed them against the chest of the unconscious man sprawled across 3 first-class seats. The plane lurched violently to the right, sending an empty oxygen mask swinging like a pendulum above her head. Panic erupted throughout the cabin. Screams, prayers, the sound of luggage tumbling from overhead bins. But Naomi heard none of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the ashen face of Spencer Aldridge, the cold, distant millionaire who had barely acknowledged her existence when she'd boarded Flight 2187 just 3 hours earlier. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she continued compressions. "You can't die without telling me why. Why did you have that photo? Why were you watching me?" 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, as the aircraft battled through the worst turbulence the pilot had seen in 27 years of flying, a 12-year-old girl from the poorest neighborhood in Newark fought to save the life of a man worth more than her entire community combined. She had no idea that his next words, if he lived to speak them, would shatter everything she thought she knew about herself. 3 hours earlier, Naomi Carter clutched her backpack tightly against her chest as she shuffled down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 777. Each step deeper into the plane's cabin felt like entering an alien world. The soft blue lighting, the hushed conversations in languages she couldn't identify, the flight attendants with their perfect smiles and crisp uniforms. All of it was so far removed from her daily life in East Newark that she might as well have been walking on the moon. "Excuse me, honey." A flight attendant with a nameplate reading Patricia touched Naomi's shoulder. "Are you traveling alone?" Naomi nodded, her throat suddenly too dry to speak. The woman's eyes softened with a mix of concern and something else. Was it pity? Naomi had seen that look countless times before, especially since Ms. Bernice had gotten sick. "Let me see your boarding pass." Patricia extended her hand, her red nails gleaming under the cabin lights. She studied the slip of paper and raised an eyebrow. "Seat 14A. That's right this way, sweetie." As they moved past the curtains separating first class from economy, Naomi couldn't help but glance at the passengers in the premium section. Most were absorbed in laptops or reclining with eye masks already in place, but one man caught her attention. Unlike the others, he wasn't working or sleeping. Instead, he sat perfectly still, staring out the window with such intensity that Naomi wondered if he could see something no one else could. He was older, maybe in his early 60s, with silver hair that contrasted sharply with his tailored black suit. A heavy gold watch peeked from beneath his starched cuff, and a leather briefcase sat securely between his polished shoes. Everything about him radiated power and wealth, yet there was something in his expression, a flicker of something that seemed out of place, vulnerability, regret. Before Naomi could decide, he turned and met her gaze. "Here you are, honey. 14A. Patricia gestured to a window seat. "It's not too crowded today, so you've got the whole row to yourself. Lucky you." Naomi slid into her seat, grateful for the small mercy of extra space. This flight, her first ever, wasn't something she'd planned or saved for. It had arrived in the form of a certified letter 3 weeks ago, along with a pre-purchase ticket and a brief, cryptic note. "Your presence is requested in Edinburgh regarding an inheritance matter. All expenses paid. Discretion advised." Ms. Bernice had been suspicious immediately. "Sounds like one of those scams that's always on the news," she'd said, her voice raspy from years of cigarettes. And more recently, the treatments that left her too weak to get out of bed most days. Nobody leaves money to folks they don't know. But the letter had included details, specific details, about Naomi's father. Things only someone who knew him could have known. Her father, Darnell Carter, who had died when Naomi was just 4 years old. A man she remembered more as a feeling than a face. Warm hands, a rumbling laugh, the smell of peppermint and motor oil. And so, after weeks of debate, multiple calls to the Edinburgh law firm listed on the letterhead Everhart and Blake LLP, serving distinguished clientele since 1972, and a visit from a notary who verified that yes, this was legitimate, Ms. Bernice had reluctantly agreed to let Naomi make the journey. Just be careful, she'd warned, as the medical transport prepared to take her back to the hospital for another round of treatments. The world ain't always kind to girls who look like you, especially when they're alone. Those words echoed in Naomi's mind as the plane began to taxi. She was 12 years old, flying across an ocean, to meet strangers who claimed she was entitled to something left by someone connected to her father. It sounded like the beginning of one of the mystery novels she devoured by the dozen, borrowed from the mobile library that visited her neighborhood every other Thursday. Except, this wasn't fiction. This was her life, suddenly taking a turn she never could have imagined. The engines roared to life, pressing Naomi back against her seat. She closed her eyes and tried to calm her racing heart. Whatever awaited her in Scotland, she would face it with the same determination that had gotten her through everything else. Her father's death, her mother's disappearance 3 years later, the challenges of being raised by a grandmother whose love was as fierce as her health was fragile. As the plane lifted off the ground, Naomi felt a curious mixture of fear and hope. For the first time in her young life, she was leaving behind everything familiar. The worn brick apartment with its perpetually leaking faucet, the corner store where Mr. Jin sometimes slipped her an extra candy bar for being such a good student, the community center where she spent afternoons when Ms. Bernice had doctor appointments, her school, where teachers alternately praised her intelligence and lamented her attitude problem when she questioned their low expectations. But there was freedom in this departure, too. For a few precious days, she would be more than that poor Carter girl or the kid with no parents. She would be a traveler, an adventurer, someone with a mysterious appointment in a foreign city. The thought made her smile despite her nervousness. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Around her, passengers began to settle in for the 7-hour journey. Some pulled out tablets or books. Others adjusted travel pillows or requested drinks from the flight attendants now moving through the cabin. Naomi reached into her backpack and removed the book she'd brought for the flight. A dog-eared copy of The Secret Garden that had belonged to her father. It was one of the few things of his that she possessed. Its pages were filled with his handwritten notes in the margins. Sometimes, when she missed him most acutely, she would read those notes and imagine him reading the same words, sitting in the same spots she did, his thoughts reaching across time to connect with hers. She was just opening to her bookmarked page when a commotion from first class caught her attention. The man who had stared at her, the one with the silver hair and expensive suit, was standing now, his voice raised in evident displeasure. "This is unacceptable," he was saying to a harried-looking flight attendant. "I specifically requested a vacant seat beside me. I'm not accustomed to sharing my space with strangers." "I understand, Mr. Aldridge," the attendant replied, her professional smile never wavering. "But I'm afraid with today's configuration, this is the best we can do. Mr. Chun is also a Platinum Elite member. Do you have any idea who I am?" Spencer Aldridge lowered his voice, but the intensity of his words carried back to where Naomi sat. "One call from me to your corporate office and—" "Spencer, please." The second passenger, a middle-aged Asian man in a simple gray suit, spoke up. "If it's so important to you, I'm happy to move." "That's not the point." Aldridge shook his head. "It's about respect for commitments made. When Transatlantic promises me something, I expect them to deliver." Naomi couldn't help but roll her eyes. The problems of the wealthy never ceased to amaze her. Here was a man upset about having to sit next to someone in the most luxurious section of the plane, while she was grateful just to have a row to herself in economy. But there was something else about the exchange that nagged at her. The way Aldrich had said the name James with a familiarity that suggested these weren't two strangers having an awkward encounter. And the other man, though outwardly calm, held himself with a tension that spoke of complicated history. The situation resolved itself when a flight attendant escorted Mr. Chan to a different seat in first class, leaving Aldridge to his coveted isolation. As he sat back down, his gaze swept the cabin, and for the second time connected with Naomi's. This time she didn't look away. Something about his entitlement, his coldness, made her want to challenge him. She held his stare until, surprisingly, it was he who broke the connection. Turning abruptly to speak to a flight attendant, Naomi returned to her book, but the words blurred before her eyes. Her mind kept returning to Aldridge's face in that moment of eye contact. Not the arrogance or irritation he displayed during the seating dispute, but something altogether different. For just an instant, she could have sworn she saw recognition, but that was impossible. What would a man like Spencer Aldridge, who complained about the proximity of other first-class passengers, know of a girl from East Newark who wore second-hand clothes and had never been on a plane before today? The thought was so preposterous that she almost laughed aloud. Clearly, the excitement of the journey was making her imagination work overtime. She forced herself to focus on her book, losing herself in the story of another orphan girl finding her way in an unfamiliar world. An hour into the flight, as the flight attendants began serving drinks, Naomi noticed Aldridge standing again, this time moving with purpose toward the lavatory at the front of the first-class cabin. As he passed by the dividing curtain, something fell from his jacket pocket. A small folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor, just on the economy side of the partition. Without thinking, Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt and slipped into the aisle. She picked up the paper, intending to return it. Perhaps it was important, a business card, a receipt, a note. As she straightened, holding the folded square, a strange impulse overcame her. Later, she would question why she did it. What instinct had prompted her to cross a line she knew was wrong? But in that moment, standing alone in the aisle with no one watching, she carefully unfolded the paper. It wasn't a business card or a receipt. It was a photograph, worn at the creases, as if it had been folded and unfolded countless times. The image showed a young black couple standing before a modest house, their arms around each other, both smiling broadly at the camera. The woman was petite, with close-cropped hair and a dimple in her right cheek. The man was tall and lean, wearing faded jeans and a Howard University t-shirt. Naomi's heart stopped. She knew that dimple. She saw it in her own reflection every day. And the man, there was no mistaking him. It was her father. Her hands began to tremble so violently she nearly dropped the photo. Why would Spencer Aldridge, a white millionaire businessman, be carrying a picture of her parents? The couple in the photo looked young, probably in their early 20s, suggesting the picture had been taken years before Naomi was born, before her father died, before her mother vanished. The lavatory door opened. Naomi quickly refolded the photo and stepped back toward her seat, her mind racing. Aldridge emerged, his expression troubled. For a moment he paused, patting his pockets, as if searching for something. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the floor. Naomi slid back into her seat, the photo clutched in her trembling hand. She should return it. She knew that. But how could she explain having looked at it? And more importantly, how could she give it back without asking the question now burning in her mind? How did you know my parents? She watched as Aldridge returned to his seat, still patting his pockets with increasing agitation. He signaled to a flight attendant, and soon several crew members were discreetly searching the first-class cabin floor. Naomi's heart pounded against her ribs. She felt like a thief, though what she'd stolen wasn't the photo itself, but the knowledge of its existence, knowledge that connected her somehow to this cold, wealthy stranger. As the search continued fruitlessly in first class, Naomi made a decision. She would return the photo, but not yet. First, she needed to understand why Aldridge had it. Was this connected to the mysterious inheritance she was traveling to Edinburgh to discuss? Was Aldridge himself involved in whatever had prompted that cryptic letter? She carefully placed the photo inside her copy of The Secret Garden, marking the spot where she'd been reading. Whatever this meant, she needed time to process it, to think through her next steps. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing the cabin to shudder. the seatbelt sign illuminated with a chime. Around her, passengers reached for their drinks and secured loose items. Naomi buckled her seatbelt mechanically, her thoughts still consumed by the discovery. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking," a calm voice announced over the intercom. "We're experiencing some light turbulence as we pass through a weather system. I've turned on the seatbelt sign as a precaution. Our flight attendants will temporarily suspend service until we reach smoother air. We anticipate this should only last about 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience." The turbulence intensified, the plane dipping and rising like a boat on rough waters. Naomi gripped the armrests, her stomach lurching with each drop. She had never experienced anything like this, had no frame of reference for the sensation of being suspended in air, at the mercy of invisible currents. For the first time since boarding, she felt a flash of real fear, not about the photo, not about Aldrich, but about the fundamental vulnerability of hurtling through the sky in a metal tube, thousands of feet above the earth. "It's perfectly normal," said a gentle voice beside her. Naomi turned to find an elderly woman had taken the aisle seat in her row, a passenger who must have moved during the drink service when Naomi was distracted by the photo. "I've been flying since the 70s. The woman continued, her southern accent as comforting as a warm blanket. "Back when smoking was allowed and they served real food on china plates. A little bumpy air is nothing to worry about." The woman had silver-gray hair styled in a neat bob, and she wore a matching lavender sweater set that reminded Naomi of something Ms. Bernice might wear to church. Her liver-spotted hands were adorned with several rings, including a wedding band that looked too large for her slender finger. "I'm Lucille, by the way. Lucille Hartman," she said, offering Naomi a peppermint from a small tin. "These help with the ear pressure and settle the stomach, too." "Thanks." Naomi accepted the candy. "I'm Naomi. Naomi Carter. First flight?" Lucille asked knowingly. Naomi nodded, slightly embarrassed at how obvious her nervousness must be. "Well, you picked a beautiful day for it. Once we get above these clouds, the view is going to be spectacular." Lucille patted Naomi's hand. "Are you traveling to Edinburgh for pleasure or business?" The question made Naomi pause. How could she explain her situation to a stranger? It sounded implausible even to her own ears. "It's complicated," she finally said. "Sort of. Family business, I guess." "Ah." Lucille nodded sagely. "Family business often is complicated. I'm visiting my son and his husband. They moved to Edinburgh 5 years ago for his work. He's in finance, very successful. They've been after me to visit ever since. Finally decided to take the plunge for my 75th birthday next week." "Happy early birthday," Naomi said, grateful for the distraction from both the turbulence and her troubled thoughts. "Thank you, sweetheart. You know, you remind me of my granddaughter. She's a bit older, 17 now, but she has that same look in her eyes, like she's taking in everything, missing nothing." Lucille's gaze was shrewd, despite her grandmotherly appearance. That kind of awareness serves a person well in this world, especially when they have to grow up faster than they should. There was something in the way she said it, not with pity, but with recognition, that made Naomi feel seen in a way few adults ever saw her. It was both comforting and unsettling. The plane steadied as they climbed above the weather system. Sunshine streamed through the windows, transforming the cabin from its artificial dimness to a space filled with natural light. "What did I tell you?" Lucille gestured to the window. "Spectacular." Naomi looked out to see an endless expanse of fluffy white clouds stretching to the horizon, gilded by sunlight. It was like a landscape from another world. Pristine, peaceful, impossibly beautiful. For a moment she forgot about Aldrich, forgot about the photo, forgot about the mysterious inheritance. She was simply a girl, experiencing the magic of flight for the first time, sharing it with a kind stranger who treated her like a person worth knowing. The moment was shattered by a commotion from first class. Raised voices, the sound of movement, a flight attendant rushing forward with purpose. Naomi couldn't see what was happening, but she could feel the shift in energy throughout the cabin. as passengers craned their necks and whispered to one another. "Excuse me." Lucille flagged down a passing flight attendant. "Is everything all right up front? Just a passenger feeling unwell." The young man replied with practiced reassurance, "Nothing to worry about." But his tight expression and the way he hurried back toward first class told a different story. Something serious was happening, and the crew was trying to manage it without alarming the other passengers. Naomi's thoughts immediately went to Aldridge. She didn't know why. There were dozens of other passengers in first class, but somehow, she was certain he was at the center of whatever was unfolding. Was it possible? Was this connected to the photo, to her parents, to her presence on this flight? The irrational thought that she had somehow caused this, through her discovery of the photo, flashed through her mind. She shook it off. That was magical thinking, the kind Ms. Bernice gently discouraged when Naomi was younger and believed she could influence events through ritual or thought alone. "I should see if they need help," Lucille said suddenly, unbuckling her seatbelt. "I was a nurse for 47 years, critical care." "Ma'am, please remain seated." The same flight attendant reappeared, his voice firmer. "We have the situation under control." "Young man." Lucille fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. "I've been handling medical emergencies since before you were born. Now, is it cardiac? Seizure? Allergic reaction?" The flight attendant hesitated, torn between protocol and the potential value of professional assistance. "Sir," another flight attendant called from the front of economy, "we need that medical kit now." That settled it. The first attendant hurried to retrieve the kit, while Lucille, with surprising agility for her age, moved toward first class. Without conscious decision, Naomi found herself following. Something pulled her forward. Curiosity, concern, or perhaps a deeper instinct, connected to the photo still hidden in her book. "Naomi, honey, stay in your seat." Lucille called over her shoulder, but Naomi couldn't. Whatever was happening, she felt compelled to witness it. As they reached the partition between cabins, the scene in first class became visible. A cluster of people surrounded a single seat, Aldridge's seat. The businessman was slumped forward, his face ashen, his breathing labored. James Chun, the passenger he'd earlier objected to sitting beside, was supporting him, while a flight attendant held an oxygen mask to his face. "Possible cardiac event," someone was saying. "Does anyone have aspirin?" "Sir, can you hear me?" "Mr. Aldridge, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." Lucille stepped forward with the authority of decades in medicine. "I'm a registered nurse. Let me through, please." The crew made way for her immediately, relief evident on their faces. As she bent to examine Aldridge, his eyes fluttered open for a moment, disoriented, unfocused. Then his attention sharpened, moving past Lucille to where Naomi stood at the edge of the gathering. Recognition flashed across his features, followed by something that looked like desperation. His lips moved beneath the oxygen mask, forming words Naomi couldn't hear. He struggled to sit up, reaching toward her with a trembling hand. "Sir, please remain still," Lucille instructed gently but firmly, pressing him back against the seat. "You need to stay calm." But Aldridge's eyes remained fixed on Naomi. Intense and pleading, he pulled the oxygen mask aside. "The photo," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "Please." A flight attendant replaced the mask, but not before Naomi heard those words. Confirmation that whatever medical crisis Aldridge was experiencing, it was somehow connected to the image she'd found, the image of her parents. "What photo?" Lucille asked, checking Aldridge's pulse at his wrist. He shook his head weakly, still staring at Naomi with that strange, desperate expression. "Young lady," James Chun addressed Naomi directly, "do you know what he's talking about?" All eyes turned to her. She felt frozen in place, caught between truth and self-preservation. If she admitted to having the photo, she would have to explain how she'd obtained it. By taking something that wasn't hers, by looking at something private. But if she denied it, she might be withholding something important to a man in medical distress. Before she could decide, the plane lurched violently. The plane lurched violently again. Sharper this time. A jolt that sent drinks flying and gasps erupting across the cabin. Naomi stumbled backward, her shoulder striking the edge of a seat. Someone screamed. Overhead bins popped open. A laptop case tumbled into the aisle. Everyone, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The flight attendant's voice was no longer calm. It was commanding, edged with urgency. Lucille Hartman shouted something about a defibrillator, her voice half drowned by the rising noise of concern and confusion. Spencer Aldridge had gone limp again. His arm dangled off the seat, fingers twitching once, then falling still. "We need that 80 now," Lucille barked. "I've got no pulse." Another attendant sprinted down the aisle toward a compartment. James Chun took over the oxygen mask, while Lucille began chest compressions with a practiced rhythm. The sound of her hands against Aldridge's sternum loud and jarring in the narrow cabin. Naomi stood frozen, heart hammering against her ribs. She was 12. She wasn't supposed to see this, but she couldn't look away. "Miss, back to your seat," a steward called sharply from behind. Naomi moved slowly, reluctantly, back toward her row, every part of her screaming to stay and watch, to understand. She had just reached her seat when she heard it, the unmistakable chime of the captain's intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've been alerted to a medical emergency in the forward cabin. We are declaring a priority landing and diverting to Shannon Airport in Ireland. Estimated time to ground, 21 minutes. A wave of murmurs swept through the passengers. People fidgeted, whispered. Naomi sat motionless, her hand clenched tightly around the edge of her seat. Shannon, that wasn't Edinburgh. That wasn't where she was supposed to go. What if they took everyone off the plane? What if the people at Everhart and Blake never heard from her again? And more than anything, what if Spencer Aldridge died? What if the man who carried a photo of her parents, who had looked at her like he knew her, took whatever secrets he held to the grave? The minutes crawled by. Lucille worked tirelessly, alternating between compressions and commands for oxygen, aspirin, vitals. The crew did their best to assist, but it was clear Lucille was the most experienced person in the cabin, possibly on the plane. Naomi watched from the edge of her seat as James Chun took her place at Lucille's side. He held Aldridge's hand, murmuring something too low to hear. Naomi's chest ached. She didn't understand what was happening. She couldn't understand, not yet, but she felt it, felt that this moment was a hinge, turning point. That man, that photo, this flight, somehow it all connected. When the plane landed in Shannon, emergency crews were already waiting. The moment the wheels touched the tarmac, the cabin erupted in applause, but it quickly faded when the doors opened and paramedics rushed aboard. Lucille stepped back with sweat streaking her temples and a grim set to her mouth. "He's still with us," she told a flight attendant. "Barely, but I got a pulse back 5 minutes ago." The crew and passengers alike parted like a wave as the gurney was wheeled down the aisle. Naomi pressed against the window, watching as Spencer Aldridge was lifted onto it, his head rolling weakly to the side. His eyes fluttered open and locked onto hers one final time before the paramedics surrounded him. "You have to tell me what this means," she whispered, so softly no one heard. "Please don't die before you tell me who you are." Passengers remained seated as Aldridge was wheeled off, followed by James Chun and 2 members of the flight crew. The pilot's voice came back on the speaker. "We will be refueling shortly and receiving clearance to continue on to Edinburgh. Thank you for your patience and cooperation." Naomi sat very still, hands folded in her lap. Lucille returned a few minutes later, her face pale. "They got him stable. Barely. I'm no cardiologist, but I'd wager he's had warning signs for a while. Most men like him ignore them." "He looked at me," Naomi said quietly, "before they took him off." Lucille gave her a strange look. "Did you know him?" Naomi shook her head, then paused, then nodded. "Not really, but he had something. A photo of my mom and my dad when they were young." Lucille's brows drew together. "You sure it was them?" "Yes, I've seen that photo before. My grandmother has a copy. It was taken right after my mom found out she was pregnant. That's why she was smiling like that. She always said it was the happiest day of her life. And this man, this Aldridge, he just happened to have a copy?" Naomi nodded, feeling the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "And when he saw me on the plane, he stared at me like he knew me." Lucille sat back, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. "You didn't tell anyone, did you?" "No. I found the photo when it fell out of his jacket. I meant to give it back. But then he started looking for it, and I panicked." Lucille was silent for a long moment. Then, in a much softer voice, "Sweetheart, I don't think that was an accident." Naomi looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Lucille gave a small shrug. "I mean, what are the odds? You, a girl traveling alone going to Edinburgh for family reasons, and him with a picture of your parents." Naomi swallowed hard. The tears spilled over. I think he's my father." Lucille didn't laugh, didn't scoff. She just reached out and gently took Naomi's hand in hers. "Then you're going to need answers, baby girl. And you're not going to stop until you get them." By the time Naomi stepped off the plane in Edinburgh, she felt like she'd lived through an entire lifetime. Her legs wobbled beneath her as she descended the jetway, her backpack heavier than before. Not because of its contents, but because of what it meant now. The photograph was still tucked safely in the secret garden. Spencer Aldridge was somewhere in a hospital in Ireland, and Naomi was about to walk into a world that had started unraveling the moment she buckled her seatbelt back in Newark. She moved cautiously through customs, answering questions with quiet politeness. When asked the reason for her visit, she simply handed over the official document from Everhart and Blake LLP. The officer scanned it, raised an eyebrow, and waved her through without further comment. Outside the terminal, the overcast Scottish sky pressed low. A man in a charcoal suit stood beside a black car, holding a sign with her name on it. "Naomi Carter, Miss Carter?" he asked in a clipped accent as she approached. "I'm Colleen Everhart. Welcome to Scotland. I represent the estate of Mr. Spencer Aldridge. I'll be escorting you to our offices in Newtown." Naomi nodded mutely. She climbed into the back seat of the sleek vehicle, the leather seats cool against her palms. The drive through Edinburgh was a blur. Cobblestone streets, gray stone buildings, spires that looked like something from a medieval fairy tale. Naomi had never seen anything like it. She felt small, out of place, but not unworthy. She was here because someone had sent for her, because someone, possibly the same man who had collapsed a few hours ago, believed she had a right to be. The car stopped in front of a stately stone building with a brass plaque that read, "McFarlane Private Trust Bank." In partnership with Everhart and Blake LLP, Colin led her through a set of double doors and down a quiet corridor until they reached a private conference room. A woman in her 30s, sharp cheekbones, dark green blouse, and severe glasses, stood to greet her. "Naomi Carter," she said warmly. "I'm Taryn Blake, your assigned counsel. May I say, it's an honor to meet you." Naomi blinked. "Why?" Taryn's expression didn't change, but her voice softened. "Because you're at the center of something very important, something that began long before you were born." She gestured to a seat. Naomi slid into it, clutching the straps of her backpack tightly. The table held several folders, a manila envelope, and a small black box that looked like it belonged in a movie. "Before we begin, I want to assure you of two things," Taryn said, sitting opposite Naomi. "First, everything you're about to hear is legally documented and supported. And second, you are under no obligation to respond or agree to anything today. We're simply here to inform you." Naomi nodded slowly. "Okay." Taryn reached for the envelope, opened it, pulled out a handwritten letter on thick paper, the edges slightly worn. "This was written by Mr. Aldridge," she explained. "It's the first of several letters he drafted over the last year. Each one is intended to explain a different piece of your connection to him and to the Aldridge family legacy." Naomi's fingers trembled as she accepted the letter. Her name was written across the top in precise black ink. To Naomi Carter. She unfolded it carefully. Dear Naomi, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and I can only hope that you'll forgive the lateness of this letter, and the cowardice that prevented me from delivering it myself. You don't know me, but I've known of you since before you were born. Your mother, Vanessa, was the bravest woman I've ever met. Your father, Darnell, the most honorable man I've ever known. I failed them both, and in doing so, I failed you too. The details will come in time. Names, dates, truths that were hidden for what I once believed were good reasons. But the truth is never a burden to be concealed. The truth is light, and I owe you all of it. Enclosed in this file is a copy of a document your mother once signed, a guardianship agreement she prepared in case something happened to her or Darnell. My name is on that document. I should have protected you. I didn't. Instead, I built a life of comfort while you grew up without the people who loved you most. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I only ask for your ear and your patience, as I attempt to give you the pieces I never had the courage to deliver in person. Spencer Aldrich. Naomi stared at the letter for a long time. Her hands had gone numb. Her breath felt shallow. Taryn Blake waited silently, giving her space. Naomi swallowed. He knew my mom and dad. Taryn nodded. Very well. He had some kind of agreement with them? About me? That's correct. Naomi's voice dropped to a whisper. Why didn't he ever come for me? Taryn hesitated, then answered honestly. That's something only Mr. Aldridge can explain, but I think he wanted to, desperately. He just didn't know how. Naomi folded the letter with shaking hands and slid it back into its envelope. What happens now? Taryn offered a small smile. Now you read everything he left you, at your own pace. We'll help you understand it all. Legally, emotionally, financially. There's a lot more, but for now just this. She handed Naomi the small black box. What's this? Something he asked me to give you first. Naomi opened it slowly. Inside was a simple silver locket. She lifted it carefully, pried it open, and found a tiny photograph inside. Her parents, smiling, younger than she remembered. And on the opposite side, a slip of folded paper. She pulled it out. For words, written in Spencer's precise script. He never stopped looking. That night, Naomi lay awake in the plush hotel bed, staring at the ornate ceiling of the Balmoral Hotel. The room was too quiet, too soft, too far from everything she'd ever known. She turned the silver locket over in her palm, opening and closing it again and again. He never stopped looking. But if that were true, why hadn't he ever written, or visited, or shown up when she was 5 and crying at the window of the group home? She didn't have answers yet, but she had something, a beginning. The next morning, she met Taryn Blake again in the lobby. Together, they drove back to the McFarland Private Trust Bank. Inside a private vault room in the lower level, a small safe deposit box was placed before her. Naomi hesitated. He left it in your name, Taryn explained. It's been untouched since the day he prepared it. Naomi nodded, with shaking fingers. She inserted the key and turned it. Inside were 3 items: a stack of handwritten journals bound in blue leather, a faded manila envelope labeled Camden, admissions packet, and a thick letter addressed simply, Naomi. Read this after the journals. VC. Naomi's throat tightened at the initials. Vanessa Carter, her mother. She lifted one of the journals carefully and opened to the first page. October 12th. Naomi's favorite thing today was a box of crayons. Not new, just bright. She lined them up on the windowsill and told me each one had a name. This is Sunshine, she said, pointing at the yellow one. And this is Danger. Tapping the red. She doesn't know how much I need these moments. How afraid I am that they'll be the last. The doctor says it's manageable. That word doesn't mean what they think it does. Manageable isn't what I want. I want to live. Naomi felt her breath catch. Her mother's voice, captured in ink, alive on the page. She turned to the next entry. October 18th. James made pancakes this morning. Burned them, of course. Naomi said they were perfect. It's like eating clouds with crusts, she told him. He laughed so hard he dropped the syrup bottle. I hadn't heard him laugh like that in weeks. There is so much love in this tiny apartment, and so much fear. If anything happens to us, she must be protected. Naomi closed the journal. Overwhelmed. She hadn't known these memories existed. Hadn't imagined that her mother had written about her. Loved her so fiercely. Even in the face of illness, Taryn placed a gentle hand on the table. Take your time. There are 8 volumes in total, all written during the final 2 years before Vanessa disappeared. Why didn't anyone tell me? Naomi whispered. Why didn't I get these when I was younger? They were locked in a secondary vault. Taryn replied softly. Spencer Aldridge had them stored under joint access, only to be opened upon his death or your confirmed identity. But he's not dead. No, but he's given legal authorization. Yesterday, before boarding the flight, he signed an amendment. He knew something might happen, and he wanted you to have the truth, no matter what. Naomi stared at the journals. So he planned to tell me. Yes, Taryn said gently. He was preparing. Naomi returned to the hotel with the box tucked securely in her backpack. She didn't speak much during the ride, didn't eat that night. She just sat at the window, looking down over Princess Street as the lights of Edinburgh flickered to life, and read. Page after page, her mother's handwriting looping in steady rhythm. Sometimes joyful, sometimes desperate. December 2nd. Naomi has a fever. She curled up beside me and whispered, Don't go. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. Elite. James doesn't sleep anymore. He watches me like I'm going to vanish. He knows, even if he won't say it. I wrote Spencer last week, told him everything, begged him to make it right if the worst happens. He hasn't answered, but I still believe. Somewhere under all that steel, he remembers who he used to be. Naomi clutched the journal to her chest. She didn't understand it all yet. Why her mother had reached out to Spencer. Why Spencer had waited 12 years to respond. But she knew this much. Vanessa Carter had not abandoned her. She had fought for her, loved her until the very last breath. And now, Naomi had pieces of that love preserved in paper and ink. It wasn't enough, but it was something, and she would read every word. By morning, Naomi had read every page of all 8 journals. Her eyes ached. Her back was stiff from sitting curled on the window seat for hours. But her mind was clearer than it had ever been. She had cried, yes, but more than that she had learned. About her mother's hopes, her father's quiet strength, their love, their fears, and the choices they made, some brave, some desperate. And most of all, she had learned about Spencer Aldridge, the man her mother had once trusted enough to name as guardian, the man who hadn't answered her letter, the man who had carried that photo for 12 years, and collapsed with her name on his lips. Taryn Blake met her in the hotel breakfast room. Naomi barely touched her toast. I want to see him, Naomi said. Taryn nodded. I thought you might. We've already contacted the hospital. He's still in the ICU in Shannon, but stable. He's asked to see you if you're willing. I am. Aaron studied her for a long moment, then offered a small smile. You're braver than most grown women I know. I'm not brave, Naomi replied quietly. I'm just tired of being a question nobody wants to answer. The flight to Ireland was short, under 2 hours. Taryn stayed close by, but didn't crowd her. Naomi spent the trip rereading the letter from Spencer, over and over, trying to memorize every curve of his pen, every word of regret. They landed in Shannon and were taken straight to the private medical facility where Spencer Aldridge was recovering. It wasn't what Naomi expected. No glass walls, no gleaming muchiness, just a quiet room, a hospital bed, an older man with too many wires and too few colors in his face. But he was awake, and when she stepped into the room, his eyes lit up like she'd pulled the sun inside with her. Naomi, he whispered. You came. She nodded, didn't speak. She stood at the foot of the bed, unmoving, until he reached out a trembling hand. "Please," he said. "Sit." She did, slowly, carefully, hands folded tightly in her lap. For a long time they just looked at each other. Then finally, "I'm sorry," he said. It was barely a breath, but she heard it, felt it. "I know," she whispered. "I should have come sooner." "Yes," she said. "You should have. I failed your parents. They forgave you," she said softly. "In their writing. My mom. She believed you'd remember who you used to be." Spencer closed his eyes. A tear slid down the side of his face. She was too good for this world. They both were. He nodded, then reached toward the table beside his bed, fumbled until he found a small wooden box. Inside were 2 more letters. "These were meant for your 16th birthday and your high school graduation," he said. "Your mother wanted you to have them when you were ready. I've been holding on to them, waiting for the right moment. I never imagined it would be like this." Naomi took them carefully. "I'll wait to read them," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. "I want to," she said. "I think." She wrote them believing I'd have some stability by then, that things would be better. Spencer nodded again. "You look like her," he said after a moment. "But your voice, that's your father. Same rhythm, same quiet fire." Naomi felt her throat tighten. "He used to hum to me," she said. "This low sound, like a distant motor, when I couldn't sleep." Spencer smiled through his pain. He did that when he worked on cars. It helped him concentrate. They sat in silence again. Then Naomi asked the question she'd been holding back. "Why didn't you answer her letter?" Spencer looked like she'd hit him. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I thought I'd already done enough damage. I told myself staying away would be better, that you'd be better off never knowing me." "You told yourself wrong." "I know." Naomi stood. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "But if you want me in your life, you have to be in mine. Not just in letters, or boxes, or trusts. Real." Spencer nodded, tears in his eyes, gratitude in every shaky breath. "Deal?" he whispered. Naomi reached for his hand, held it, and for the first time, neither of them let go. 2 weeks later, Naomi stepped off a connecting flight in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The air was dry and warm, with that faint red haze she'd only seen in photos. Desert mountains in the distance, everything a little quieter than the cities she'd known. Waiting at the arrival gate was a face she hadn't seen in too long. Ms. Bernice. She was in a wheelchair, thinner than Naomi remembered, but her eyes were sharp, and when she saw Naomi running toward her, those eyes filled with tears. "You came back," Ms. Bernice whispered, as Naomi wrapped her arms around her. "I promised I would," Naomi replied. They spent the next few days in a private care facility just outside Santa Fe, where Ms. Bernice was receiving experimental treatments covered entirely by a private medical endowment Spencer Aldridge had arranged. Naomi stayed in the room with her, reading aloud from The Secret Garden, then switching to the journals. She told her everything about the flight, the photo, the letters, the truth. And Ms. Bernice, though overwhelmed, listened quietly. "Your mama always had secrets," she said softly, "but she never stopped loving you. Don't ever doubt that." "I don't," Naomi said. "Not anymore." One afternoon they received visitors. A nurse wheeled Ms. Bernice into the garden, where a black sedan pulled up on the gravel path. Out stepped Spencer Aldridge, walking slowly with a cane, assisted by a young woman in an eggshell blue suit. "You made it," Naomi said. Spencer gave a faint smile. "Wouldn't miss it." He looked thinner, too paler, but he stood taller than she expected. "Ms. Bernice," he said, nodding respectfully, "thank you for raising her. Some of the credit goes to the Lord," Bernice replied, ever firm. "But most of it goes to her own stubbornness." Spencer chuckled. "That I believe." The young woman who had arrived with him stepped forward. "I'm Lydia Aldridge Brooks," she introduced. "Spencer's daughter." Naomi blinked. She hadn't expected this. "You're his only child until now." Lydia said without malice. "But I've read the documents, the journals, and I'm here to say, whatever you need to feel safe, supported, and seen, you'll have it. We're family now." Naomi didn't know what to say, but Spencer put a hand on Lydia's shoulder. "She fought for this," he said. "She didn't have to, but she did." That evening, under the Santa Fe stars, Naomi sat beside Ms. Bernice on a wooden bench. Lydia and Spencer had gone inside. The desert night was quiet, punctuated only by the soft chirp of insects and the faraway rustle of wind through low brush. "You ready to go home soon?" Ms. Bernice asked. "Maybe," Naomi replied, "but I don't know where that is yet." Ms. Bernice nodded slowly. "Sometimes home isn't where you're from. It's where you choose to heal." Naomi leaned her head against the older woman's shoulder. "Then maybe I'll stay here a while." The next morning, she received one final letter. It had arrived by private courier, sealed with Spencer's initials. Inside was a check, with a number Naomi couldn't fully process, and a handwritten message. "Use this for school, for travel, for windows and crayons and all the dreams your mother had for you. You are the best thing she ever made. Love, Spencer." Naomi didn't cry. She just folded the letter, pressed it against her heart, and closed her eyes. 3 months later, she sat in a small classroom at Camden State University's satellite program in Santa Fe, part of a youth summer intensive for gifted students in literature and creative writing. She was the youngest in the class, but when it was her turn to read, she stood with steady hands and a steady voice. "This is from a journal," she said, "written by a woman who never got to finish her story, so I'm here to finish it for her." And she read,